The low, mechanical hum of the Studer A80 reel-to-reel tape machine vibrated through the steel workbench, humming a steady, low-frequency drone that rattled the empty coffee mug sitting right beside my right hand. I adjusted the green plastic tension arm with the tip of my thumb, feeling the sharp friction of the magnetic oxide ribbon gliding smoothly past the playback head as the spools turned in a slow, hypnotic dance. My name is Kevin. Tell me. Have you ever spent a suffocating, pitch-black midnight locked deep inside the sound isolation basement of the Los Angeles Police Department headquarters back in the early 1980s, where the air smells perpetually of stale tobacco smoke, ozone, and decaying acetate tape? Most people think police work happens out on the sunlit streets, under the flashing red lights of patrol cars, amid the screech of tires and the shouting of detectives interviewing witnesses behind yellow crime scene tape. They imagine bright squad rooms, clacking typewriters, and orderly filing cabinets containing clear, undeniable evidence that locks criminals away forever. They do not know what it is like down here in the basement sublevels, where the windows are sealed shut against the smog of downtown LA and the only light comes from a single, hooded red bulb hanging directly over a workbench covered in razor blades, splicing blocks, and spools of broken magnetic wire. They do not know about the heavy, suffocating silence that fills the room between the rhythmic, whispering hiss of an unshielded track spinning at 7.5 inches per second. Have you ever asked yourself why a man with steady hands and a quiet disposition would willingly spend his nights hunched over a heavy machine, splicing together the shattered audio fragments of tragedies that happened 10 or 20 years ago? Let me tell you. It is not because of the modest paycheck handed down by the municipal budget office, which barely covers rent on a cramped studio apartment in Echo Park and a carton of unfiltered cigarettes. It is because when you are trying to drown out the noise of your own failing marriage and a career going nowhere fast, the hypnotic, mindless precision of repairing a mangled audio cassette or an open reel tape feels like the only place where you can actually fix something that was broken. At least, it does until the night shift rolls past 2 in the morning and a box marked unsolved lands on your desk from the cold case archives. Tonight was supposed to be a routine cleanup. An endless labyrinth of cardboard archive boxes, steel shelving units, and towering stacks of magnetic tape reels filled the small, carpeted room on every side, smelling of vinegar syndrome and old dust. My job was entirely manual, meticulous, and agonizingly slow. Select the damaged, brittle acetate or polyester ribbons recovered from old field recorders found at historical crime scenes. Inspect the magnetic coating under a magnifying glass, searching for microtears, stretching, and moisture damage caused by decades of storage in damp evidence lockers. Use a precision brass splicing block and a non-magnetic razor blade to cut out the ruined sections at a precise 45-degree angle, joining the remaining clean ends together with microscopic strips of pressure-sensitive splicing tape. And run the repaired reel back through the deck, monitoring the VU meters to ensure the audio track was clean enough to present before a grand jury or a weary superior officer. My fingers were permanently stained a dark, chemical gray from handling cleaning alcohol and iron oxide residue, the rough surfaces slick with sweat as I planted my elbows onto the wooden workbench and reached out to mount a fresh, heavy 10-inch metal reel onto the left spindle. The air conditioner rattled loudly inside the metal ductwork overhead, sending long, shivering gusts of cold air across my neck, while the red darkroom bulb cast a deep, crimson glow over the dials and switches of the console. I pressed the silver power toggle, watched the neon tubes inside the VU meters flicker to life with a warm amber light, and listened to the distant, muffled rumble of traffic passing along First Street 3 floors above my head. And then, right through the steady, hypnotic background hiss of the open reel transport, the heavy steel door of the sound booth gave a slow, metallic click. The heavy steel door of the sound booth swung inward with a faint, hydraulic hiss, letting a thin wedge of white fluorescent light spill across the dark, crimson-tinted carpet before clicking shut again with a heavy, vacuum seal. I didn't turn around immediately. I kept my eyes fixed on the spinning hubs of the Studer tape deck, my right hand resting lightly on the brass rewind toggle while the magnetic ribbon hissed a steady, rhythmic white noise through the open-air monitors. Have you ever experienced that sudden, spine-chilling drop in temperature when someone enters a room behind you without making a single sound on the carpet, knowing full well that you are locked down in a restricted basement where nobody is supposed to wander after midnight? People always talk about coworkers as a welcome distraction from the grinding monotony of a graveyard shift, a familiar face stopping by to share a cup of stale coffee, drop off paperwork, or swap cynical jokes about the precinct brass. They imagine friendly greetings, turning around to see a colleague leaning against the doorframe, and the comforting normalization of shared space in the dark. They do not know the unnatural, suffocating dread of working in a soundproofed vault where footsteps are completely swallowed by acoustic foam, leaving you to rely entirely on the hairs standing up on the back of your neck. They do not know what it feels like when your heart hammers against your ribs and every instinct tells you that whoever just walked in isn't holding a cup of coffee. I slowly let go of the tape deck and spun my metal drafting stool around, facing the dark gap between the towering acoustic baffles near the entrance. The hallway outside was empty. No night shift detective carrying a stack of files. No weary precinct runner dropping off late-night evidence bags. Only a standard manila evidence box resting squarely on the corner of my small side desk, stamped with a bright red label that had faded to a dusty pink around the edges, LAPD Cold Case, File 04-1970, Coldwater Canyon. Think about how much confidence we place in our physical barriers and secure badges, believing that as long as we keep ourselves locked inside a building guarded by armed officers upstairs, the horrors of the city's past cannot reach our desk. We lock our doors, we badge our way through turnstiles, and we tell ourselves that the blood spilled on the asphalt 10 years ago is safely contained within paper files and black and white photographs archived down in the vault. We believe that time is a disinfectant, turning brutal murders into neat, historical statistics that can be catalogued, filed away, and forgotten by everyone except the historians. Then an unsolved evidence box lands on your desk without a footprint to explain how it got there, and you realize your sound booth is just a listening post for things that never stopped bleeding. I pushed myself off the stool, my boots making a soft scuff against the industrial carpet as I walked over to the side desk and looked down at the manila box. The cardboard was warped at the corners, smelling sharply of damp basement storage, old tobacco, and chemical decay. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the rusted metal clasp, and flipped the lid open under the dim red glow of the darkroom bulb. Inside rested a single, heavy 10-inch metal reel wrapped in a clear plastic sleeve, along with a yellowed carbon copy transcript dated October 14, 1970. The typewritten header on the top sheet read simply, Audio Recovery, Residential Homicide, Tape 01, Original Field Recording. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would remain steady if you pulled a reel from an evidence box and saw your own department's missing persons number scrawled across the hub in fresh red grease pencil? We are all just temporary technicians cleaning up the static of a city that records every scream. I lifted the heavy metal reel out of the box, walked back to the workbench, and mounted the spool onto the left spindle of the Studer deck, ready to pull the first 500 feet of tape through the pinch roller. The heavy metal reel settled onto the brass spindle of the Studer deck with a solid, satisfying clunk, the machined aluminum edges wobbling just a fraction of a millimeter before locking true into the drive motor teeth. I reached for the end of the brown magnetic ribbon, my thumb and index finger catching the clear leader tape where it had been crudely spliced with yellowed cellophane back in the autumn of 1970. Have you ever experienced that peculiar, hyper-focused numbness that settles over your nervous system when you are about to handle a piece of physical evidence that everyone else gave up on years ago? People always talk about audio restoration as a clean, clinical science, a matter of digital filters, frequency equalization, and waveform cleanup performed on glowing computer monitors in modern sterile labs. They imagine tidy technicians in white coats pushing buttons while software algorithms instantly erase background noise and isolate crystal-clear voices from the past. They do not know the agonizing, analog reality of working in a basement with 30-year-old machinery, where a single slip of a non-magnetic razor blade can slice clean through a vital sentence of testimony. They do not know what it feels like when your breath catches in your throat because the tape you are about to thread smells faintly of ancient copper and wet dust. I pulled the brown ribbon across the tape path assembly, carefully guiding it behind the tension roller, past the high-speed erase head, and directly across the polished chrome face of the playback head. My fingers moved with the practiced, mechanical precision of a man who had spent 4 years staring at microscopic magnetic tracks under a magnifying lamp. Left thumb holding the ribbon taut against the capstan shaft. Right hand pulling the loose end over to the empty take-up reel on the right spindle. I slotted the tapered end into the narrow hub slit, gave the aluminum flange 3 quick manual turns to anchor the oxide layer, and dropped the pinch roller down with a firm, pneumatic thump. Think about how much trust we place in magnetic tape, believing that plastic ribbons coated in iron oxide can act as infallible time capsules that lock human suffering safely inside a uniform, repeatable loop. We record our words, we archive our conversations, and we tell ourselves that as long as the spool remains wound tight on its metal hub, the past is safely contained and cannot reach out to bite us. We believe that sound is fleeting, that once words leave a mouth and fade into the air, they are gone forever, reduced to nothing more than memory and ghost stories. Then you thread a field recording from a cold case onto an open reel deck, and you realize that tape doesn't just store sound, it holds the room's entire atmosphere hostage, waiting for someone to hit play. I reached out my hand, hovered my finger over the silver transport buttons, and paused. The red darkroom bulb cast a deep, crimson stain across the aluminum faceplate of the machine, turning the silver switches and the amber VU meters into pools of dripping blood. From somewhere deep inside the basement ventilation shafts, a low, rhythmic shudder rattled the metal ductwork, the sound of the old building settling against the heavy Los Angeles smog outside. I took a deep drag from my cigarette, let the gray smoke drift slowly toward the acoustic ceiling tiles, and pressed the play button. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep hovering over a play switch if you knew what was recorded on the first 300 feet of a forgotten 1970s homicide tape? We are all just temporary technicians cleaning up the static of a city that records every scream. The tape motor whined softly as it spun up to speed, and right through the open-air studio monitors, the deep, heavy hiss of unshielded magnetic tape filled the room, followed immediately by the faint, muffled sound of a distant telephone ringing in an empty house. The sudden, sharp ring of a rotary telephone echoed out of the studio monitors, cutting straight through the heavy white hiss of the magnetic tape with an unnatural, jarring clarity that made me jerk my hand back from the console. Ring, ring, ring. It wasn't a modern electronic chime. It was the heavy, brass bell clapper of an old Western electric model striking metal within the hollow acoustics of a suburban living room 16 years in the past. Have you ever experienced that dizzying, psychological disorientation when an audio track you are reviewing in a dead silent room sounds so immediate, so close, that you instinctively expect to turn around and see the source standing right behind your chair? People always talk about historical recordings as distant artifacts, museum pieces wrapped in static and crackle, separated from the listener by an impassable river of years, technology, and decay. They imagine listening to the past the way you look at an old photograph, observing from a safe, detached distance, knowing that whatever happened in that frozen frame is finished, over, and safely locked away in history. They do not know the gut-wrenching claustrophobia of working with open-reel field tapes recorded by police responders on the night of a massacre, where the microphone picked up every stray acoustic detail of a house frozen in mid-tragedy. They do not know what it feels like when the background noise of an old recording sounds less like a technical artifact and more like someone breathing right next to your ear in the dark. I gripped the edge of the wooden workbench, my knuckles turning white as I stared straight ahead into the red-tinted gloom of the sound booth, my eyes locked on the amber needles of the VU meters jumping rhythmically with every ring of the phone. Asterisk 1. 2. 3 asterisk. On the fourth ring, the sound of the bell cut off abruptly, replaced by the heavy, muffled click of a receiver being lifted from its cradle in a distant hallway. Then came the breathing. It was slow, ragged, and heavy, the sound of an adult male standing directly in front of a sensitive condenser microphone, trying desperately to silence his lungs but failing against the pressure of raw adrenaline or exertion. Hoo, hoo. Through the acoustic monitors, I could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the tape transport running at 7.5 IPS, capturing every microscopic wobble of the aging acetate ribbon as it dragged across the playback head. Think about how much confidence we place in the physical separation of time, convincing ourselves that a tragedy from 1970 cannot possibly reach across the decades to intersect with our lives in 1984. We listen to cold case audio files, we write our technical reports, and we file our paperwork, telling ourselves that we are just objective professionals processing data for a municipal archive that nobody reads anymore. We believe that the dead are completely silent, that their final moments are permanently trapped behind plastic tape and iron oxide coating, unable to affect the world outside the laboratory. Then an open reel deck in a basement playback booth starts broadcasting heavy, wet breathing that doesn't match the written transcripts in your hand, and you realize the past is just waiting for a machine to turn it back on. I reach down with a trembling hand, grabbed the yellow typewritten transcript from the side desk, and flipped frantically to page 2, my eyes scanning the official police notes recorded by the original field investigators on October 14, 1970. Asterisk log entry 2:14 a.m. Audio picks up open telephone line at residence. No voice response from receiver. Background sound indicates heavy wind and rainfall against exterior glass, asterisk. I stopped reading. My eyes darted back to the glowing amber meters on the Studer deck. There was no wind on the tape. There was no sound of rain against exterior glass. Instead, underneath the heavy, ragged breathing coming through the studio monitors, I could hear a distinct, rhythmic metallic scraping sound, like a sharp kitchen knife dragging slowly across the wooden floorboards of a dark hallway. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep sorting through cold case files if the audio track playing on your machine started describing the exact room you are sitting in right now? We are all just temporary technicians cleaning up the static of a city that records every scream. Before I could reach out to hit the stop button, the heavy breathing on the tape suddenly paused, and a cold, rasping whisper crawled out of the left speaker channel, calling my name across the static, asterisk, Kevin, turn around. Asterisk. The whisper crawled straight out of the left monitor speaker, dry and raspy, carrying the distinct acoustic resonance of a microphone held inches away from a wet mouth in a narrow, windowless corridor. Kevin. The name hung in the damp air of the sound booth, vibrating against the acoustic foam panels and echoing back with a faint, metallic tape delay effect that had never been stamped into the original 1970 police transcript. Have you ever experienced that absolute, blood-freezing paralysis when a disembodied voice speaks directly to you from a piece of vintage hardware, calling you by name in a locked room where you are supposed to be completely alone? People always talk about auditory hallucinations as the harmless product of fatigue, caffeine withdrawal, and the droning white noise of machinery working late into the night. They imagine that when you spend 12 hours a day listening to old audio tapes in a dark basement, your tired brain simply starts playing tricks on you, turning random tape hiss and mechanical artifacts into familiar words. They do not know the gut-wrenching terror of realizing that your brain didn't invent the sound because the needle on the VU meter is jumping in perfect, violent synchronization with syllables that were never written down in the official file. They do not know what it feels like when an anonymous killer from a 14-year-old cold case addresses you as if he has been sitting across the workbench the entire shift. I didn't turn around. My fingers froze a fraction of an inch above the silver transport controls of the Studer deck, my eyes locked on the amber needles of the VU meters as they twitched violently back and forth in response to the dead man's breath. Hoo, click, scrape. The metallic dragging sound on the tape grew louder, shifting from the left speaker channel to the right, crossing the stereo field with terrifying proximity, as if whatever was holding the microphone in 1970 was now walking in a slow, deliberate circle around my wooden workbench. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper, and forced my right hand to slap down hard against the silver stop button. Clack. The mechanical brake engaged with a heavy, satisfying thud. The spinning metal reels shuddered, slowed down, and ground to a dead halt. The white tape hiss died instantly. The room plunged into an absolute, suffocating silence, a heavy, tomb-like stillness broken only by the low, distant hum of the building's air conditioning vents 3 floors above. Think about how desperately we rely on mechanical switches to give us the illusion of control, believing that as long as we can cut the power, flip a toggle, or hit a stop button, we can silence the ghosts trapped inside our equipment. We tell ourselves that machines obey our commands, that magnetic tape is just plastic and iron oxide, and that once the power is cut, the voices have nowhere left to go. We believe that our secure badges, our locked steel doors, and our modern electronics are enough to keep the past safely compartmentalized on the other side of the playback head. Then you kill the power to a reel-to-reel machine, and the audio keeps playing right out of the empty air beside your ear without a single drop of electricity running through the deck. The Studer deck was completely dead. The neon tubes inside the amber VU meters were unlit, the power toggle was locked in the off position, and the heavy metal reels sat motionless on their spindles. Yet, rising clear and distinct from the dark space directly behind my drafting stool, the slow, rhythmic scraping of the kitchen knife against the floorboards continued. Screech, scrape, screech. It was closer now. So close that I could smell the sharp, metallic tang of rusted iron and old copper rising off the carpet, mixing with the stale tobacco smoke lingering around my chair. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep resting on a workbench if you heard bare feet stepping out of the dark behind you on a basement floor that was supposed to be empty? We are all just temporary technicians cleaning up the static of a city that records every scream. I gripped the edge of the wooden table, my knuckles aching from the pressure, and stared straight into the red-tinted glass of the front console as a pair of cold, wet hands slowly descended from the darkness to rest flat upon my shoulders. The pressure of those cold, wet palms settling onto my shoulders was not heavy with physical mass, but with an absolute, crushing density, as if the weight of every unsolved homicide file in the LAPD archives had suddenly been condensed into 2 freezing points of contact against my cotton shirt. A sharp, metallic odor rose from behind me, thick with the stench of stagnant copper, old rainwater, and the unmistakable rot of cellar dust that had been sealed beneath floorboards for 14 long years. Have you ever experienced that absolute, suffocating terror of sitting completely motionless in the dark, knowing that if you flinch, if you breathe too loudly, or if you turn your head a fraction of an inch, whatever is standing behind your chair will finish what it started in 1970? People always talk about fear as an adrenaline rush, a sudden spike of energy that prepares you to fight, to run, or to scream for help down a long, echoing hallway. They imagine panic as a burst of motion, a frantic scramble away from danger, and a desperate bid for survival against an intruder in the night. They do not know the paralyzing reality of total, helpless dread, where your muscles lock solid against your bones and your nervous system simply shorts out under the realization that there is nowhere left to run in a locked basement. They do not know what it feels like when the dead don't chase you from a distance, but lean down to rest their chin right beside your ear. You missed a spot, Kevin. The voice didn't come from the speakers anymore. It vibrated directly through my collarbone, thick and wet, carrying the rasp of a throat that hadn't drawn breath since the Nixon administration. The cold hand slid slowly inward from my shoulders, tracing the contours of my collar with creeping, sluggish fingers until they hovered just above my throat. Across the room, under the crimson glare of the darkroom bulb, the Studer tape deck suddenly hissed back to life on its own. The supply spool began to spin backwards, unwinding miles of brown magnetic tape in a chaotic, whipping frenzy that sent loose loops spilling out across the workbench and tangling around the brass editing blocks. Think about how carefully we build our routines, locking ourselves behind steel doors and security badges, convincing ourselves that the horrors of the city belong safely in the past where they can be catalogued and forgotten. We sit at our workbenches, we clean up the static, and we tell ourselves we are just public servants keeping the archives in order. Then the tape starts running backward, the red bulb flickers out, and you realize you aren't archiving history, you are waiting your turn on the reel. The cold fingers close gently around my windpipe. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would stay steady if the tape machine started recording your own final breath? We are all just temporary technicians cleaning up the static of a city that records every scream. The pressure around my windpipe did not crush or snap, but tightened with a slow, deliberate suction, as if the air in my lungs was being drawn straight out through my skin and fed directly into the spinning reels of the dead machine. My vision began to narrow at the edges, the crimson glow of the overhead darkroom bulb bleeding outward into thick pools of bruised purple and pitch black. Have you ever experienced that complete, detached serenity when you realize that your body has finally stopped fighting the inevitable, and the only thing left in the world is the relentless, mechanical sound of a tape deck pulling you toward the end of the track? People always talk about final moments as a flash of light, a hurried review of a lifetime passing before your eyes, or a desperate last effort to break free from whatever holds you down. They imagine panic pushing a person to claw at the walls, kick over furniture, and scream for a rescue that never comes down the dark corridors of a municipal building. They do not know the quiet, suffocating resignation of sitting perfectly still in a soundproofed basement while your own history is unspooled onto a dirty carpet. They do not know what it feels like when the room stops being a room and turns into an endless spool of magnetic ribbon. I could feel my boots lifting clear of the floorboards. My body wasn't being dragged backward by physical muscle, it was being drawn into the horizontal plane of the workbench, pulled forward by the irresistible tension of the brown oxide ribbon whipping wildly across the chrome playback heads. The audio monitors mounted on the wall above my head, speakers that had remained completely dead and unpowered since I cut the main console switches, suddenly crackled with a violent burst of feedback. Hiatus pop crackle. And then, louder and clearer than before, the sound of 1970 filled the entire basement, rain lashing against glass, a rotary phone ringing in an empty hallway, and a heavy kitchen knife scraping slowly, methodically against a wooden floor. Think about how effortlessly we separate ourselves from the wreckage we handle, convincing ourselves that we are merely observers passing through a world full of broken things that other people left behind. We sign our time cards, we collect our paychecks, and we tell ourselves that the tragedies locked inside archive boxes are safely contained behind steel doors and security codes. We believe our hands are clean because we wear gloves, use tools, and keep our distance from the blood on the tape. Then the machine pulls you into its circuit, and you realize that every file you ever restored was just a blank reel waiting for your name to be recorded on the track. My fingers brushed against the metal edge of the Studer deck, the cold aluminum biting into my skin as the final loops of magnetic ribbon wrapped tightly around my wrists, binding my arms to the console like copper wire. The red darkroom bulb overhead gave one final, violent flicker, popped with a sharp electrical snap, and plunged the entire basement into absolute, velvety darkness. In the pitch-black void, right against my ear, the wet, rasping voice spoke the final entry into the log. Asterisk, end of file, Kevin. Tape speed, 0. Asterisk. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep editing other people's screams before the machine starts recording your own final track? We are all just temporary technicians cleaning up the static of a city that records every scream. The total darkness of the basement was not empty, it was thick, heavy, and saturated with the physical presence of miles of unspooled magnetic ribbon wrapping around the furniture, the floorboards, and my own chest. Without the red glow of the darkroom bulb, my eyes strained against a void so absolute that even the outline of the Studer tape deck had vanished, leaving only the chilling, tactile sensation of cold metal cutting into my skin. Have you ever experienced that profound, disorienting panic when all sensory input is suddenly stripped away, leaving you entirely alone with the sound of your own frantic heartbeat echoing in your ears? People always talk about darkness as a temporary absence of light, a simple shadow that retreats the moment you flip a wall switch, open a door, or strike a match. They imagine that darkness is passive, a neutral space where you can wait safely until morning restores the familiar outlines of the room. They do not know the suffocating terror of a darkness that is actively manufactured by a machine, a dark space filled with the silent, creeping movement of invisible magnetic tape slithering across the floor like chilled wires. They do not know what it feels like when the lights go out because the archive has finished recording you. I tried to pull my hands away from the console, but the brown oxide ribbon had wound itself tightly around my forearms, binding me to the machine with a strength that felt less like plastic and more like iron bands. From the absolute blackness of the speaker monitors, the steady white noise of the tape hiss returned, not as a soft background hum, but as a roaring, deafening static that filled the entire room. And then, cutting through the electronic storm, came a new sound. Asterisk clack click. Whir asterisk. It was the unmistakable mechanical sound of a second tape deck spinning up in the darkness directly across the room from where I stood bound to the workbench. Think about how blindly we trust that our stories belong to us, believing that our lives are written in real time by our own choices, free from the interference of external recorders and forgotten archives. We walk our streets, we do our work, and we tell ourselves that whatever happens in the dark stays buried in the past where nobody else can reach it. We believe that our private fears, our regrets, and our quiet mistakes are safely locked inside our own heads, invisible to the city around us. Then a second machine starts spinning in an empty basement, and you realize that every word you ever spoke has already been logged, duplicated, and filed away for playback. The invisible tape deck across the room reached running speed, and through the roaring static of the monitors, a voice began to speak. It wasn't the raspy whisper of the cold case from 1970. It was my own voice. "My name is Kevin," the speaker recited in a calm, flat, bureaucratic monotone that I had never used in my life. Asterisk audio technician, night shift, Los Angeles Police Department. File active. Playback initiated. Asterisk. I opened my mouth to scream, to deny the words, to tear myself away from the console, but no sound came from my throat. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers would keep typing your own story if you heard a machine in the dark reciting the final chapter before you even lived it? We are all just temporary technicians cleaning up the static of a city that records every scream. As my own recorded voice began to describe the exact position of my hands on the workbench, the cold, wet fingers touched my neck one last time, whispering softly into the static. Asterisk roll credits, Kevin. The tape is full. Asterisk. The air inside the pitch-black basement grew instantly heavy, saturated with the metallic scent of copper and the unmistakable chill of a tomb left open to the midnight rain. My own recorded voice continued to echo from the invisible speakers across the room, reciting the inventory of my desk, my clothing, and the exact number of years I had spent hiding away in the archives of the Los Angeles Police Department. Have you ever experienced that dizzying, surreal terror when you realize that your entire life, every conversation, every late-night shift, every quiet regret, is nothing more than an audio track waiting to be edited, chopped, and spliced by someone else? People always talk about identity as something solid and permanent, a name written on a birth certificate, a badge pinned to a shirt, or a face staring back from a bathroom mirror. They imagine that who you are is entirely under your own control, shaped by your choices, your ambitions, and your own voice speaking out into the world. They do not know the gut-wrenching dread of listening to a machine replay your words before you have even finished thinking them, treating your existence as raw material for a cold case file. They do not know what it feels like when your life is reduced to a magnetic ribbon spinning on a spindle. Whir, click. The second tape deck across the room shifted gears, its high-speed rewind engaging with a sudden, mechanical shriek that tore through the static. The invisible ribbon wrapped around my forearms tightened sharply, pulling me an inch closer to the silent workbench as the machine began to suck the audio backward, reversing every word I had spoken since the shift began. Asterisk, scream, every, records, that, city, of, static, up, cleaning, technicians, temporary, all, just, are. We, asterisk. The backward speech tumbled out of the darkness at double speed, sounding like a frantic, inhuman chant spoken by a dozen voices overlapping in unison. Think about how carefully we curate the soundtrack of our days, playing our favorite records, drowning out the silence with background noise, and believing that we are the ones holding the remote control. We turn up the volume to block out the world, we change the station when things get too heavy, and we convince ourselves that we have absolute command over the audio environment we inhabit. We believe that sound is fleeting, that once a melody ends, it vanishes completely into the empty air. Then the tape deck starts pulling you backward through your own history, and you realize you aren't the DJ, you are just the track being played until the magnetic coating wears completely off. The freezing fingers on my neck tightened their grip, sliding upward from my collar to cut my jaw with the absolute, unyielding pressure of a steel vise. A sharp flash of light, bright, blinding, and entirely blood red, slashed across the dark basement as the destroyed darkroom bulb miraculously sparked back to life overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the mountains of Manila archive boxes. In the center of the room, standing right beside the empty chair I had vacated hours ago, was a tall, thin silhouette dressed in an outdated LAPD trench coat from the 1970s, its face completely obscured by a thick, swirling cloud of dark magnetic tape dust. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep moving across the keys before a man from a cold case file steps out of the dark to take over your shift? We are all just temporary technicians cleaning up the static of a city that records every scream. The figure raised a pale, gloved hand toward the Studer deck, reached out with a non-magnetic razor blade, and pressed the sharp steel edge directly against the spinning ribbon of my life. The non-magnetic razor blade caught the crimson light of the flickering darkroom bulb, gleaming with a sharp, sterile brilliance as the figure in the outdated trench coat held it motionless against the spinning brown ribbon. The machine did not slow down. The reels continued to blur, screaming through the magnetic oxide at high speed while my own voice played backward in a distorted, mechanical loop from the dark corners of the room. Have you ever experienced that profound, paralyzing clarity when you realize that your entire existence has been trimmed down to a single, edited sequence, and you have no say over which parts get cut and which parts remain on the master reel? People always talk about life as a continuous, unfolding journey, a long road filled with unexpected turns, new beginnings, and chapters that you write for yourself day by day. They imagine that time is an open canvas, giving them the freedom to make mistakes, fix their errors, and rewrite their mistakes before the final curtain falls. They do not know the terrifying, claustrophobic reality of watching an editor hold a blade to your history, ready to splice out your final breath and paste it into a cold case file that will sit in a municipal basement forever. They do not know what it feels like when the final cut is made without your consent. The figure pressed the edge of the razor blade downward. Zzzzzzzt. A clean, violent tear ripped through the magnetic ribbon. The tension snapped instantly. The reels on the Studer deck spun out of control, flying loose from their spindles and scattering long, curling lengths of brown acetate across the floor like spilled entrails. The roaring static in the monitors died in a single, heavy microsecond, replaced by an absolute, suffocating vacuum of sound. The trench-coated figure turned its obscured face toward me, lowered the blade, and pointed it slowly at the empty splicing block resting on the corner of the workbench. Think about how carefully we protect our secrets, hiding our failures and our dark pasts behind locked doors, professional titles, and quiet routines, believing that as long as nobody finds the original recording, we are safe. We sit at our desks, we push our buttons, and we tell ourselves that our legacy belongs to us alone. We forget that the city is a vast, automated archive that never forgets a single scream, a single dropped word, or a single unsolved crime. Then the tape runs out, the razor comes down, and you realize you were never the technician at all, you were just a loose end waiting to be trimmed. The cold, wet fingers vanished from my jaw, leaving behind an icy numbness that spread deep into my chest. I looked down at my hands resting on the wooden workbench under the dying crimson glow of the overhead bulb. The magnetic ribbon was wrapping itself around my wrists again, not like a trap, but like a pair of cuffs closing for the final time. From the ceiling ventilation shaft, far above the downtown streets of Los Angeles, the faint, muffled sound of a police siren began to wail through the night air. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep editing the past before someone sits down at your desk, picks up the razor, and starts cutting your own tape? We are all just temporary technicians cleaning up the static of a city that records every scream. With a slow, mechanical click, the final spool stopped spinning, the red bulb went black for good, and the archive door locked itself from the outside. The darkness inside the basement settled like wet cement, sealing every corner of the room in an absolute, suffocating silence that made the ticking of my own wristwatch sound like a hammer striking an anvil. My wrists were bound tight to the wooden console by the curled coils of magnetic tape, cold and stiff against my skin, while the heavy smell of copper and ozone hung thick in the air. Have you ever experienced that strange, detached clarity when you realize that struggling against the system is entirely useless because every move you make was already edited into the master sequence years before you were born? People always talk about fighting for survival as a noble instinct, a fierce, burning determination to break free from restraints, smash open the locked doors, and claw your way back to the sunlit world outside. They imagine that willpower is enough to rewrite a tragic script, that a person can simply stand up, walk out of the dark, and reclaim their life from whatever forces are trying to pull them under. They do not know the soul-numbing reality of sitting motionless in a pitch-black room, watching the final frames of your own existence loop backward on a broken screen. They do not know what it feels like when you realize the door was never meant to open from the inside. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a faint red glow began to pulse from the broken darkroom bulb hanging above my head. It wasn't the steady crimson light I had worked under for 4 years. It flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting long, fractured shadows across the walls of the sound booth where thousands of manila evidence boxes sat stacked from floor to ceiling. I looked down at the workbench. The splicing block lay directly in front of me, bathed in the erratic red glow. And resting right beside the stainless steel blade was a fresh, blank reel of brown magnetic tape, spinning softly on its spindle without a motor or a belt to drive it. Think about how carefully we build our daily illusions, wrapping ourselves in professional titles, routine tasks, and secure environments to convince ourselves that we are the authors of our own destiny. We lock our office doors, we file our reports, and we tell ourselves that our stories are unique, protected by law, time, and distance from the dark things that happened before. We believe that our labor belongs to us, that our voices are our own, and that the city outside respects the boundaries of our private lives. Then you find yourself strapped to a workbench in an archive that nobody visits, watching a blank reel wait for your final confession to fill its empty tracks. The phantom tape machine clicked. The invisible brown ribbon unspooled from the fresh reel, sliding smoothly across the chrome guide pins, crossing the empty playback head, and wrapping itself securely around the metal core of the take-up spool. A low, subterranean hum began to vibrate through the floorboards, not the sound of the LAPD basement, but the deep, resonant echo of a street corner in 1970, filled with the distant wail of sirens and the heavy patter of rain against asphalt. And then, my own voice emerged from the dark, speaking in a calm, flat tone that didn't belong to a living man. Asterisk, file number 04. Subject Kevin. Recording active. Asterisk. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep moving across the keys before the archive finishes recording your chapter and files you away in the dark? We are all just temporary technicians cleaning up the static of a city that records every scream. As the blank reel picked up speed, the cold, wet fingers returned to my shoulders, pressing down with final, unyielding weight as the machine began to record the silence that follows the last cut. The final reel spun in absolute silence, its brown magnetic ribbon winding smoothly onto the aluminum hub as the last traces of static faded from the monitors and the red glow of the darkroom bulb burned down to a dull, dying ember. My hands rested flat against the wooden surface of the workbench, completely free of the tapes that had bound them, yet feeling entirely weightless, as if the bone and muscle had been replaced by thin strips of recorded acetate. Have you ever experienced that profound, echoing stillness that settles into a room when a story finally reaches its ultimate conclusion and the last machine clicks off for good? People always talk about endings as a form of liberation, a final curtain falling on a stage, a closed book returned to a shelf, or a locked door that separates the past from a bright, untrodden future. They imagine walking away from their work at the end of a long shift, stepping out into the cool night air, and leaving the troubles of the workplace behind in the dark. They do not know the hollow, soul-numbing reality of realizing that you were never the person operating the machine, but merely the final track recorded onto a master reel that cannot be erased. They do not know what it feels like when the archive closes its doors and you realize there is no morning shift waiting to take your place. I looked down at the Studer tape deck. The machine was completely still. The power toggle was locked in the off position, the neon tubes in the VU meters were dark, and the metal spools sat motionless on their spindles. Yet, in the center of the take-up reel, beneath the transparent layers of brown ribbon, a small, perfectly typed paper label caught the dim red light of the dying bulb. It didn't bear a 1970 case number. It didn't list a cold case homicide or an unsolved residential crime. It bore a single name, typed in clean, professional capital letters by a machine that never makes a mistake. Kevin, file closed. Think about how meticulously we arrange our lives, stacking our papers, tidying our desks, and convincing ourselves that our daily labor is an investment in a legacy that will outlast us. We write our stories, we clean up the static of the world, and we tell ourselves that our names are securely written into the permanent record of the city. We forget that the archive is infinite, patient, and hungry for fresh tape. Then you stand alone in the dark basement, looking at a finished reel with your own name on the spine, and you realize that every hour spent cleaning up the screams was just practice for your own final recording. I reached out my hand and touched the cold aluminum flange of the take-up reel, feeling the faint, residual vibration of a tape transport that had finally finished its work. Outside the sound booth, far up the basement stairs and past the heavy steel security doors, the distant sounds of Los Angeles began to wake up to a new dawn, car horns blaring on First Street, sirens wailing in the distance, and the relentless, mechanical heartbeat of a city that never stops recording. I pulled my fingers back, stepped away from the workbench, and turned toward the dark hallway. The heavy steel door swung open on its own, revealing a long, empty corridor stretching endlessly into the white fluorescent light of the morning. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the warmth of a secure room, the steady glow of a desk lamp, and the peaceful silence of a night untouched by static and rot. How long do you think those fingers will keep writing your story before the archive finishes your reel and files you away in the dark? We are all just temporary technicians cleaning up the static of a city that records every scream.